parents are Basque in nature, or they were. They're deceased now, but they came from the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain. When they came, my father came to this country first, and about 3 or 4 years later, my mother came to this country. My father finally located Basque people in Buffalo, Wyoming, and he moved there from the eastern part of the country. But when my mother came over, Spain does not have a port on the Atlantic, so she had to go to Bordeaux, France, and wait for a ship to go by that was heading for the United States. And finally, one did, and it was full of Italians. My mother was a fantastic fandango dancer, and she danced with castanets. And so the Italians, of course, Spanish and Italian are so close that she could speak to them very easily. And she danced and sang all the way over to the United States. And when she got here and went through immigration and came past the Statue of Liberty, after all her processing, they put her on a train and sent her to Clermont, Wyoming, because that was the closest stop for a train to Buffalo. The trouble with it is she didn't know they had a dining car on the train, and so she didn't eat anything from New York all the way to Clermont, Wyoming. But she did. My dad picked her up there. My dad couldn't drive then, but he hadn't learned how to drive yet, and Louis Falsa, brought him to Clermont, and I picked up my mother, and eventually my father homesteaded in the mountains above Buffalo, and had something like 4,000 head of sheep. But he was a wayward individual, and finally my parents divorced, and she remarried. We lived in Reno for 1 year. I went to school there for a year. And she met her second husband there, and we moved back to Buffalo, Wyoming, and where my stepfather bought a bar. And from then on until until I left home, I was always the barkeeper. I had to clean the bar every Sunday after church. There wasn't a very good relationship between cleaning bars and going to church. But anyway, it worked out pretty good. Eventually, I graduated from high school, went into the service, and ended up in Denver, Colorado. But eventually, I moved to Montana and lost an eye, and then went to college. I started college when I was 38 years old. And after I graduated from college, I got a job teaching first in Great Falls, Montana. Then I worked out a job in Missoula, Montana, and I taught auto mechanics for 3 different high schools in Missoula, Montana, and they're still there: Hellgate, Big Sky, and Sentinel. And I was located at Sentinel. Eventually, I retired and moved to Sheridan, Wyoming, and that's where I live at this time. I'm 85 years old. I don't know if I'll make another year or not. Time will tell. Yes, I do have a further story about my life around Sheridan, Wyoming. We lived here we lived on Lower Prairie Dog, which is not too far out of here, but we ran sheep there, and I was the youngest one, and my sisters and my brother were all in country school, but I had to stay home alone. And at that time, I really adopted an affection for dogs, and I still have that affection. I have a dog right now. But one thing I had when I was 5 years old, and I had to stay home every day, was a blind black sheep, and a large one, with ram's horns and the whole thing. And I could ride him all over the countryside, because I'd steer him with his horns, and I'd kick him like I was riding a horse, and he'd go right along. I don't know whatever happened to him. But eventually we moved into town. We weren't in the country. And then within 2 or 3 years, we moved to Buffalo, and my father homesteaded in the mountains above Buffalo. Of course, that was where we ran our sheep in the summertime. We lived in Buffalo. I graduated from high school, and the weird part of it is, for 2 years I lived in in Montana and didn't go to school in Buffalo. But then after my sophomore and junior year, I moved back to Buffalo. And even after having been gone for 2 years, I was elected senior class president. Those people must be deluded in Buffalo. But anyway, I graduated from there and eventually ended up in Missoula, Montana, where I taught until I retired. I'm back again. I want to talk to you about the VA hospital here in Sheridan, Wyoming. It's one of the best VA hospitals around, and no problems here. Every building on that, it used to be a cavalry post. And it's built up on the side of the hill. They can see all around the countryside. I'm sure it's for Indian protection. It was. And every building is built of masonry. There's not a frame building in the whole fort. And it's a beautiful place, and all the facilities are great. And a lot of veterans live there. I don't, of course, but I do go there for my doctors. And my doctor is the doctors there, it's kind of strange. The reason they are there is because you cannot sue a doctor that works for the U.S. government for malpractice. And that's why a lot of them go to the VA, because they can't be sued. But I have an excellent doctor, and he's called Dr. Vic because his last name is so complicated that nobody can pronounce it. But he's 6'10" tall, and he's a very good doctor. So one day I asked him, I said, well, doctor, since you're so tall, how do you explain that? And he said, well, this is a private story and I don't want you to tell anybody, so I haven't up to this time. But he said, the reason I got to be so tall is that as I was growing up and start wearing shoes, my mother had a little trait that made me grow up. Before I got my shoes in the morning, she filled both shoes with horse manure. And that's what made me grow. And he's an excellent doctor, and I really appreciate going to the VA hospital here for treatments. When I went through high school in Buffalo, Wyoming, I really didn't amount to much, but as soon as I got out of high school, graduated from high school, I went to work for the Bureau of Reclamation on a survey team. And we did aerial topography. We checked aerial topography maps in the mountains. And I worked in the mountains of the Bighorn Mountains here in Wyoming and into Montana, and eventually all the way down into Colorado, almost all the way to New Mexico. But then I got drafted a little later on for the Korean War. And when I went over to the just before I went there, on the survey team, they took us over to the Basin Country, which is on the other side of the Bighorn Mountains. And I was working for the government, and they had to put us up. And so they provided us with lodging in a very practical place that they owned. And at the time, it was right after the Second World War, and they put us in the Japanese detention camp at Hart Mountain, Wyoming. And we lived there. There were 6 of us that lived in one barracks, and it cost us $5 for a month. 6 of us, $5 for a month. And while we were there, it was late in the fall, and it was getting cold, and there was only one switch and one light in each barracks. And as you came in the door, the switch is there by the door, and that's the only light that you could turn on. But anyway, we took turns turning the lights off, and one night when it was my turn and we were sleeping on cots with our own sleeping bags, all the guys in the room said, hey, Taberna, it's your turn to turn off the light. Well, it was getting pretty cold, and I didn't want to get out of my warm sleeping bag, and so I reached underneath my cot in a bag that I had and drew out a device that had a 32 marked on it, and that meant 32 automatic. And so I aimed it at the bulb and blew the bulb out, and the lights were out. And the next day we went to the supply room and got a new bulb. And that's all there was to it. So I didn't freeze myself doing that job. Of course, the Japanese detention camp had been cleared out. All the Japanese had been sent back home, back to California and wherever else they came from. Okay, after my wife and I married, after I was in the service and my wife and I got married, I was going to go to an automotive school in Denver called Opportunity School, but I couldn't get in right away. I had to wait a year before I could get in. And so I went to work for Martin Marietta, south of Denver, who built the Titan missile. And I lived in Denver, but I had to drive 27 miles to get to work and right through Denver, which wasn't very convenient. And so eventually I was living in a trailer house, and there was a person south of Denver in a little town called Louviers who wanted to trade their house, which was a company house for DuPont, for a trailer house. And so I traded my trailer house for a little house, an old house, and moved, and it was only 3 miles to work on a gravel road. So while I was living there, and incidentally, we changed linoleum one time, and when they took the old linoleum up and it had newspapers underneath it, the newspapers read 1929, so it was an old house. But anyway, this was a dynamite plant, and Louviers is part of DuPont's name. And so then I only had a short drive to get to work, and my kids went to school south of Denver to a little town, and they really appreciated it, and they liked it real well. And I worked there for quite some time, and this was after I'd already trained as a surveyor, but I didn't work surveying. I worked on transportation of missiles to Lowry Air Force Base, which is east of Denver. And then we loaded them on C-133As and they flew them to the Cape, and that was my job. But eventually they were laying off union employees, and I was one, and it was my turn, and so I quit and moved to Missoula, Montana. While living in Louviers, Montana, like I said, this was a munitions plant, and they produced dynamite and nitroglycerin. And it was a small town and an old town, but it was a great place to live. We lived on a boulevard. It was I traded a trailer house for this little house. But anyway, they had a dump just south of town. And in the wintertime, there was a field with a lot of sagebrush in it, and I had an old GMC pickup, and I used to tie a hood behind it, and the kids would get on the hood, and I'd tow them all around the country, going through the sagebrush and over the snow and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, in the summertime, at this dump, they had a device. It was an octagon. It was about 10 feet tall, and it had a door on one side, and it was a thing that they dispensed or distributed explosives. They put them right up on the counter. I don't know exactly how they did it, but it was a way for them to assimilate explosives. Well, they had gotten rid of it and put it in the dump, and it was pretty heavy. But I had 2 trees behind my house, and I had all these kids, and I had to provide a little bit of amusement for them. And so another fellow and I got that ammunition device, and it was an octagon, and it was actually well constructed. We loaded it into the dump on his flatbed truck. We cut the top of a dead tree off, and he and I lifted it up there and built a tree house for my kids. And I had a cable that went from there to the house, and we had a pulley device, and my kids used to get up there and hook that pulley on a cable, and they could ride that cable all the way down to the house out of that tree house. And it was really a neat ride, and the kids really liked it, and all the neighbor kids used to come over too. And it was a neat place to live. But then suddenly, Martin Marietta decided to lay off union employees, and I was one, and I was the next on the list. So I quit my job there and moved to Missoula, Montana, and went to work for a ready-mix company in Missoula. And I stayed there until I lost an eye in an industrial accident. An industrial accident paid for my college education, so I went to school in Havre, Montana, until I got a degree, and then I taught auto mechanics in Great Falls, Montana, until I could get a job in Missoula at Sentinel High School, and I taught there until I retired, and then I moved to Sheridan, Wyoming. And that's where I am now.
Talk a little bit about the Ferris wheel.
Well, while we lived in Missoula, we had a very nice location where we lived, and I always built a lot of things. And one thing I built was I took a front hub and bearing device off of a vehicle. Of course, I was not a mechanic, and I built a device that went around with bearings, just like you have on a front wheel on a car. And so from that, across the wheel on this device, I built a triangular device. Well, it was a double triangle, one vertical and one that came down. And then I welded rods across the two bars that went around the wheel, and I put a seat at the top and a seat at the bottom, and located the wheel on the tree halfway up, just so that the seat that I built on the bottom, when it was hanging down, it didn't quite get down as far as the ground. And so while one person sat on the bottom seat, and an equal weight individual climbed that ladder to the top and got in the top seat, and then they just reached out and pulled on the tree, and so they had a Ferris wheel. And they could look over the top of my house at the neighbor's house. So I had a lot of little kids that came to my house all the time to play. And my brother-in-law, right behind that, he was a very generous individual. He had owned a ready-mix company in Missoula, and he also owned a real estate company, and he owned a blacktop company. So he was a fairly affluent character. But anyway, he had me take my kids to a movie one afternoon, and while we were gone, he moved in a little barn and a Shetland pony, and gave my kids the barn and the Shetland pony. And so then after that, they had that, and all the other kids in the neighborhood came over to ride the pony. But eventually, that dissolved. I mean, we didn't have it anymore. But the barn was a problem. My mother lived next door to me, and she loved to have chickens, so she had bantam chickens. And one time we left the loft door open on this little barn. It wasn't a very big barn. And we were going away, so we closed the barn doors, and we didn't know that all the chickens were in the top part of the barn. And while we were gone, it was a hot summer day, and all of them suffocated. But eventually, we sold that place and moved away from Missoula after I retired. But it was a good place to live. My kids went to Hellgate High School, and I taught at Sentinel High School. Incidentally, while living in Missoula, Montana, and my kids were growing up, we lived, what street did we live on, Chris?
Como Drive.
Como Drive, and it was in the, I don't know what you'd call the western part of Missoula, Montana. But anyway, we had a kind of unique system. Next door to us was a big hayfield. It was a large one, too. It must have been about 5 acres, I think. And every summer, they irrigated it, flood irrigated this land next door to us. And I found out that because of the water that went down in the ground right next door, not in the next door property, our land had a lot of water that came underground. And so I had my kids dig a hole, and the hole at first started out to be as big around as a 54-gallon drum. But eventually, as my son states it now, I worked them into slave labor, and they dug a bigger hole. And I welded 2 pickup boxes together, put the top of them right together, and we sunk that in this hole. And we built a lid on the top of it, and a way to get up and down with a ladder. And in the summertime, when they were flooding this pasture next door, that hole would fill up with water, and I could pump water out of it and irrigate my yard. But in the wintertime, when they weren't irrigating, it all dried up, and the kids could go down there and play in the wintertime. There wasn't any snow down there or anything, but it was a pretty unique place. But my kids dug the hole. If you can imagine how big 2 pickup boxes welded together is, that's how big a hole they dug. And well, it had to be 8 foot deep because that's how long a pickup box is. But anyway, my kids still remember it. I don't know why. Except they exerted themselves tremendously digging that hole. But it was kind of neat. It was an interesting place. I also remember something else. I used to pump water out of there in a 2-inch black plastic pipe. That's what it came out of. And if you can imagine 50 feet of 2-inch plastic pipe full of water, that's a pretty heavy pipe. And we had a Doberman pinscher that used to come in our yard and pick up that pipe while the water was running through it and carry it. I can't imagine a dog being that. Do you remember that, Chris? That dog, I can't imagine that a dog, they're skinny too, a pitcherman, but that dog could carry that water line all the way around the house. But it was really a neat, and it was a very gentle dog, very neat dog, very kind. But we eventually moved out of there too. But I don't know what else I can tell you about that.